They met in war and never let go. If this story touched your heart, there's so much more waiting for you. Subscribe and join the journey. The autumn rain of 1943 drummed against the windows of the makeshift field hospital in the hills outside Naples, each droplet carrying the weight of a war that seemed to have no end. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of carbolic soap and quiet desperation, while the steady rhythm of footsteps on worn wooden floors created a symphony of healing that had become Margaret Whitmore's entire world. She moved between the rows of wounded soldiers with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to carry hope in her hands and steel in her heart. At 26, Margaret had already seen enough suffering to last several lifetimes, yet her green eyes still held the spark of determination that had driven her to leave her comfortable life in Boston to serve as a Red Cross nurse in war-torn Italy. Her auburn hair, perpetually escaping from its regulation pins, caught the amber glow of the kerosene lamps as she bent over a young private from Ohio, his fevered mumbling about his mother's apple pie, bringing a gentle smile to her lips. These boys, for that's what they were really, just boys playing at being men in a game where the stakes were life and death, they all reminded her of something precious that this war was slowly stealing from the world. Nurse Whitmore. The voice that called her name carried the unmistakable cadence of authority, wrapped in exhaustion. She turned to see Dr. Harrison gesturing toward the far corner of the ward, where a figure lay motionless on a narrow cot. New arrival. Shrapnel wounds, possible concussion. He's been asking for someone named Elena. Margaret made her way across the crowded room, stepping carefully around medical supplies and sleeping patients. The man on the cot appeared to be in his early 30s, his dark hair matted with dried blood, his olive-toned skin bearing the telltale marks of someone who had spent considerable time under the Mediterranean sun. Even in unconsciousness, his face held an aristocratic quality that suggested education and refinement, unusual among the enlisted men who typically filled their beds. As she began cleaning his wounds with gentle efficiency, his eyes fluttered open. They were the color of deep amber, like honey held up to candlelight, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. "You are not Elena," he said in accented English, his voice carrying the musical cadence of Italian vowels. "No," Margaret replied softly, wringing out a cloth in the basin of warm water beside his bed. "I'm Margaret, Nurse Whitmore. You're safe now." He studied her face with the careful attention of someone trying to memorize every detail. "American?" "Boston born and raised," she confirmed, dabbing at a cut near his temple with practiced gentleness. "And you're Italian, unless I'm very much mistaken." A shadow crossed his features. Was many things. Now I am simply Antonio Benedetti, and I am very much alive, thanks to you." Over the following days, as Antonio's physical wounds began to heal, Margaret found herself drawn into conversations that stretched far beyond the usual exchanges between nurse and patient. He spoke of his life before the war, a professor of literature at the University of Rome, a man who had spent his days surrounded by the works of Dante and Petrarch, only to find himself thrust into a reality more brutal than any fictional hell. "I taught my students about the nature of love through poetry," he told her one evening, as she changed his bandages by lamplight. The other patients were sleeping, and their conversation had taken on the hushed intimacy of shared secrets. "But I never understood it myself until—" He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Until I saw it reflected in the kindness of a stranger's hands." Margaret felt warmth bloom in her chest, a sensation both thrilling and terrifying. She had seen too many patients come and go, had learned to protect her heart behind professional distance. But something about Antonio. Perhaps it was the way he quoted Keats while describing the olive groves of his childhood, or how he listened to her own stories about teaching Sunday school back in Massachusetts with the same attention he might have given to scholarly discourse. Something about him made her carefully constructed walls feel as fragile as rice paper. "Tell me about Elena," she said one afternoon, settling into the wooden chair beside his bed. She had been avoiding the question for weeks, but curiosity and perhaps a touch of jealousy had finally gotten the better of her. Antonio's expression grew distant. "Elena is my sister, younger by 5 years. She has eyes like our mother's, blue as the Tyrrhenian Sea in summer." His voice carried a weight of worry that made Margaret's chest tighten with sympathy. When the Germans occupied Rome, I tried to get word to her, to tell her to flee south. But the last letter I received was in August. She was working with the resistance, hiding Allied pilots who had been shot down. The words hung between them like a prayer and a fear combined. Margaret reached out instinctively, covering his hand with hers. His fingers were long and elegant, the hands of a scholar, but they bore the calluses and scars of a man who had been forced to learn different lessons than those found in books. "She's strong," Margaret said, though she had never met this Elena. "If she's anything like her brother, she knows how to survive." "How can you be so certain?" "Because," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, "anyone who could inspire such devotion must have a strength that runs deeper than circumstance." Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, Margaret felt something shift in the space between them. It was as if all the careful boundaries she had constructed around her heart suddenly became as meaningless as lines drawn in sand before an incoming tide. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm all their own. During the day, Margaret moved through her duties with the same professional competence she had always maintained, but her eyes would inevitably seek out Antonio across the ward. He had begun helping with minor tasks as his strength returned, reading letters to soldiers who couldn't manage it themselves, translating for Italian civilians who sometimes appeared seeking news of missing loved ones, or simply sitting beside beds of men who needed someone to listen to their fears in the small hours before dawn. In the evenings, when the ward had settled into uneasy quiet, they would steal moments together. Antonio would recite poetry in his native Italian, the words flowing like music, even though Margaret couldn't understand their literal meaning. She, in turn, would tell him stories of her life in America, the way snow looked falling past her apartment window in Boston, the sound of church bells on Sunday morning, the taste of her grandmother's molasses cookies. "When this war ends," Antonio said one night, his voice soft in the darkness, "what will you do?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering. Before the war, her future had seemed as predetermined as the sunrise. She would return to Boston, perhaps marry Dr. Richards from her father's medical practice, raise children in a house with white picket fences and roses climbing the front porch. Now, that life felt like something she had read about rather than lived. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything I thought I wanted seems to belong to someone else now, someone I used to be." "And who are you now?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and fear in equal measure. Margaret looked at this man who had somehow become the center of her thoughts, who had taught her that love could bloom even in the ashes of destruction, and felt her carefully planned future rearrange itself around a single, impossible hope. "I think," she said slowly, "I am someone who could learn to love Italy, someone who could learn to make a home anywhere, as long as—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Antonio's hand found hers in the darkness, and she knew he understood. The turning point came on a December morning when the sound of approaching engines announced the arrival of military transport vehicles. "Doctor," Harrison moved through the ward with grim efficiency, checking charts and making decisions that would scatter their little community to the four winds. "Benedetti," he said, stopping beside Antonio's bed. "You're fit for discharge. There's a truck leaving for Rome in an hour. They're looking for translators and men with local knowledge." Margaret felt her heart plummet into her stomach. Rome, where Elena might be waiting, where Antonio's old life called to him like a siren song. She busied herself with reorganizing supplies that didn't need reorganizing, trying to keep the devastation from showing on her face. "Margaret." Antonio's voice was soft, urgent. She turned to find him sitting on the edge of his bed, his amber eyes intense with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Walk with me?" They made their way outside into the crisp December air, their breath forming small clouds in the cold. The Italian countryside stretched before them, rolling hills dotted with ancient olive trees that had witnessed countless human dramas play out beneath their branches. "I have to go," Antonio said, his words careful and measured. "Elena, if she's still alive, she needs to know that I survived. And there are things I must do, debts to pay to the people who saved my life." Margaret nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Of course. She's your family. But—" He stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. But you have become something I never expected to find in the middle of this darkness. You have become necessary to my soul in a way that terrifies and amazes me. Antonio, let me finish. His accent seemed more pronounced now, emotion coloring every syllable. I know what I'm asking is impossible. I know that you have a life waiting for you across the ocean, people who love you, a future that makes sense. But I also know that what we have found together is worth fighting for, worth the risk of building something new from the ashes of who we used to be. Margaret felt tears she had been holding back for weeks finally spill over. How? How could we possibly make this work? I don't speak Italian, I don't know anything about your world, and after what this war has done, we learn, Antonio said simply. We learn each other's languages, each other's worlds. We build something that honors both of our pasts, while creating space for a different kind of future. The truck horn sounded in the distance, urgent and final. I have to go now, Antonio said, his thumb brushing away her tears. But I am asking you to trust in something that has no guarantee, something that exists only in the space between hope and faith. I am asking you to come to Rome. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, pressing it into her hands. This is my address, my family's house in Trastevere. If you can find a way, if you can believe that love might be stronger than logic. He leaned forward, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that tasted of goodbye and possibility combined. Then come find me. Margaret stood in the cold December morning, watching the military truck disappear into the distance with the man who had taught her that her heart was capable of holding more than she had ever imagined. In her hands, she held a piece of paper with an address written in careful script, and in her chest, she held a decision that would change the course of her entire life. 3 months later, Margaret Whitmore stood on a train platform in Rome, a single suitcase in her hand, and Antonio's address clutched against her heart. She had spent weeks navigating military bureaucracy, calling in favors, and explaining to her family back in Boston that she needed to stay in Europe just a little longer. The truth, that she was chasing a love that defied every reasonable expectation, seemed too fragile to trust to international telephone calls. The Rome that greeted her was a city slowly awakening from nightmare. Buildings bore the scars of occupation and liberation, but flowers were beginning to bloom in window boxes, and the sound of laughter was cautiously returning to the piazzas. Margaret navigated the unfamiliar streets with a combination of determination and terror, her rusty high school Latin providing little help with the melodic complexity of spoken Italian. The address led her to a narrow street lined with buildings the color of aged terracotta and sunshine. Number 47 stood slightly apart from its neighbors, with green shutters and a wooden door that looked as though it had been welcoming visitors for centuries. Margaret raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. What if Antonio had changed his mind? What if the magic they had found in that field hospital couldn't survive in the real world? What if Elena needed him in ways that left no room for an American nurse who had abandoned everything for a love that existed mostly in hope? Before she could lose her courage entirely, the door opened. Margaret? The voice that spoke her name was higher than Antonio's, melodic with the same Italian cadence, but distinctly feminine. A young woman with sea-blue eyes and dark hair stood in the doorway, her face breaking into a smile that transformed her entire appearance. "You must be Elena," Margaret said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "And you must be the American angel my brother has been driving me mad talking about for months." Elena's English was accented but confident, and her smile held warmth that immediately put Margaret at ease. "He is at the university, teaching again, trying to help rebuild what the war destroyed. But come inside, we have been waiting for you." The house was small but filled with light, its walls lined with books and photographs that told the story of a family that had survived destruction through sheer force of love. Elena bustled about, preparing coffee with the ceremony that Margaret was learning was essential to Italian hospitality. "He was not certain you would come," Elena said, settling across from Margaret at a kitchen table worn smooth by generations of family meals. Every day he would walk to the train station just in case. Every night he would return home trying to hide his disappointment. "I wasn't certain either," Margaret admitted. It's completely insane what I'm doing." Elena's laugh was bright and knowing. "Love is always insane. This is what makes it worthwhile." She leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "But I must ask, are you here because you pity him? Because you feel obligation to heal the broken soldier you cared for?" Margaret considered the question carefully. In the month since Antonio had left, she had asked herself the same thing countless times. Was this love, or was it simply the intensity that war could create between people thrown together in extraordinary circumstances? "No," she said finally. "I'm here because I discovered that all the things I thought mattered, security, familiarity, the approval of people who've known me my entire life, none of it means anything if I'm not being true to who I've become. And who I've become is someone who loves your brother not despite the complications, but because of the way he's taught me that the best parts of life are usually the most uncertain." Elena's smile was radiant. "Then you will stay for dinner. And tomorrow we will go surprise my foolish brother at the university." That evening, as Margaret helped prepare a meal with ingredients Elena had carefully hoarded from her ration stamps, she began to understand the world that Antonio came from. It was a world where family was not just blood but commitment, where food was love made tangible, where conversation was an art form that could transform simple moments into lasting memories. "Tell me about your family in America," Elena said as they worked together, chopping vegetables by lamplight. Margaret found herself describing not just her parents and siblings, but the person she had been before the war, dutiful, careful, more concerned with meeting expectations than with following her heart. It felt like talking about a stranger. "And now," Elena prompted, "now I think I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be." The next morning, Margaret woke in a small bedroom that Elena had prepared with flowers from the market and clean linens that smelled of lavender and hope. Sunlight streamed through windows that looked out onto a courtyard where neighbors were hanging laundry and calling greetings to each other in the musical Italian that was slowly beginning to make sense to her ear. Elena appeared with coffee and fresh bread, her eyes bright with conspiracy. "Come, today you reunite with your soldier." The University of Rome bore the scars of war but maintained its dignity. Students moved between buildings with books clutched against their chests and determination in their eyes, rebuilding their futures one lecture at a time. Elena led Margaret through courtyards and corridors with the confidence of someone who had spent considerable time visiting her beloved brother. "There," Elena whispered, pointing through an open doorway. Margaret peered into a classroom where sunlight fell across wooden desks and eager faces. At the front of the room stood Antonio, looking more like the scholar he had always been than the wounded soldier she had first met. He was gesturing as he spoke, his voice carrying the passion she remembered, but directed now toward Dante rather than dreams of survival. "He is teaching about love," Elena murmured, translating his Italian words. About how Dante's love for Beatrice transformed not just his heart, but his understanding of what was possible in human experience. Margaret watched Antonio's face as he spoke, seeing the joy that came from doing work that fed his soul. This was who he was meant to be, not a casualty of war, but a teacher, a scholar, someone who could help young minds understand that beauty and meaning could survive even the worst that humanity could inflict upon itself. "Go," Elena whispered. "Let him see that some dreams do come true." Margaret stepped into the doorway just as Antonio concluded his lecture. The students began gathering their books, chattering among themselves about the assignment he had just given them. Antonio turned toward his desk and his gaze fell on the figure silhouetted in the doorway. Time seemed to stop. Margaret watched emotions play across his face, disbelief, hope, joy so profound it took her breath away. The classroom faded around them until there was nothing but the space between them and the certainty that she had made the right choice. "Margaret?" Her name was a question and a prayer combined. "I came to Rome," she said simply. "Like you asked." Antonio crossed the room in 3 quick strides, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around as if she were made of starlight and possibility. When he set her down, his hands framed her face with the same gentleness she remembered from those long-ago evenings in the field hospital. "You came," he said, wonder in his voice. "You actually came. Did you doubt I would?" "Every day. And yet I hoped every day." He kissed her then in front of lingering students who began to applaud and call out cheerful Italian commentary that Margaret suspected was thoroughly improper. "I hoped because you taught me that some things are worth believing in, even when they seem impossible." 6 months later, Margaret Whitmore became Margaret Benedetti in a small ceremony at the Church of Santa Maria in Trastevere, with Elena as her witness and a congregation of neighbors who had adopted the American nurse who had learned to speak Italian with a Boston accent and make pasta that didn't embarrass her mother-in-law. Their life together was not the fairy tale that movies promised. There were days when Margaret missed the familiar rhythms of Boston, when the weight of adapting to a new culture felt overwhelming. There were nights when Antonio would wake, calling out names of friends who hadn't survived the war, when the ghosts of what they had both witnessed demanded acknowledgement. But there were also mornings when Margaret would wake to find Antonio reading poetry aloud in the garden, his voice mixing with the sound of church bells and Elena's laughter from the kitchen. There were evenings when the three of them would sit around the kitchen table, switching between English and Italian as they planned lessons for Antonio's students or discussed Margaret's work with local hospitals. Margaret had discovered that she could build a new kind of nursing practice, one that bridged the gap between Italian and American medical approaches. Elena had surprised everyone by announcing her engagement to a young doctor who had been part of the resistance, a man who understood that strength came in many forms. "Do you ever wonder," Antonio asked one evening as they walked through the narrow streets of Trastevere, "what would have happened if that truck had taken me away from the hospital before you decided to trust something impossible?" Margaret considered the question, watching elderly men play cards at sidewalk cafes and children chase each other around fountains that had stood for centuries. "I think," she said slowly, "that some things are meant to be even when they require us to be braver than we think we can manage. And are you glad that you chose brave over safe?" Margaret stopped walking and turned to face her husband, this man who had taught her that love was not a destination, but a daily choice to build something meaningful together. Around them, Rome hummed with the eternal rhythms of life continuing, of people finding ways to create beauty even after experiencing the worst. "I am exactly where I belong," she said, and knew that it was true. They had met in war, in a place where hope seemed like an impossible luxury. But they had learned that love was not weakened by difficulty, it was refined by it, strengthened by the conscious choice to keep choosing each other through uncertainty and change. As they walked home together through streets lit by lamplight and possibility, Margaret thought about the letters she wrote to her family in Boston, trying to explain a life that couldn't be measured by conventional standards. She thought about Elena's upcoming wedding, about the students who filled Antonio's classroom with eager questions, about the patients she treated who were learning to trust in healing again. Most of all, she thought about the truth they had discovered together, that the most profound love stories weren't about finding perfection, but about finding someone worth building an imperfect, beautiful life with, one day at a time. In war, they had learned that nothing was guaranteed except the present moment. In peace, they had learned to make each present moment count. And in love, they had learned that some risks were worth taking, even when, especially when, they led to futures that couldn't be planned or predicted, only lived. The first years of their marriage tested every romantic notion Margaret had ever harbored about love conquering all. Learning Italian proved more challenging than she had anticipated, not just the vocabulary and grammar, but the subtle social cues, the unspoken rules of a culture that had been shaped by centuries of history she was only beginning to understand. There were mornings when she would wake feeling like a perpetual outsider, when the rapid-fire conversations between Antonio and Elena left her feeling isolated despite their obvious efforts to include her. There were afternoons when patients at the hospital would request a real Italian nurse, instead of the American woman, who pronounced medical terms with a Boston accent that made children giggle and elderly patients shake their heads in amused bewilderment. But there were also breakthrough moments that made every struggle worthwhile. The day she successfully haggled with a vegetable vendor in the Campo de Fiori, conducting the entire negotiation in Italian, while the man's wife nodded approvingly from behind the stall. The evening when Antonio's elderly neighbor, Signora Rossi, invited her to join the group of women who gathered each morning to share coffee and gossip, accepting her not as the foreign wife, but simply as Margaret from number 47. The turning point came during their first Christmas together. Elena had been planning the celebration for weeks, determined to create the perfect blend of Italian tradition and American touches that would help Margaret feel at home. But 3 days before Christmas Eve, Elena fell ill with a fever that left her bedridden and unable to manage the elaborate meal she had envisioned. "I have ruined everything," Elena whispered from her bed, tears streaming down her flushed face. "The dinner, the presents, the traditions Margaret needs to learn. Antonio doesn't know how to make anything except coffee and disaster." Margaret sat beside her sister-in-law, smoothing her fever-dampened hair with the same gentle touch she had once used with wounded soldiers. "Tell me what needs to be done." What followed were 3 days of controlled chaos that would become family legend. Margaret, armed with Elena's recipe notes and the patient guidance of Signora Rossi, attempted to master the art of Italian holiday cooking. The first batch of biscotti emerged from the oven, resembling charcoal more than cookies. Her attempt at making fresh pasta resulted in noodles that ranged from tissue-thin to leather-thick, often within the same strand. Antonio, meanwhile, tackled the mysterious ritual of preparing the traditional Christmas Eve feast of 7 fishes, armed with nothing more than determination and a cookbook that assumed knowledge he decidedly didn't possess. The fish merchant, recognizing a desperate husband when he saw one, took pity and provided detailed instructions along with the seafood. "This is a disaster," Antonio muttered on December 23rd, surveying a kitchen that looked as though a small explosion had occurred. Flour coated every surface, dirty dishes filled the sink, and something that might once have been intended as sauce was burning on the stove. Margaret, her hair escaping from its pins and her apron stained with various culinary experiments, began to laugh. It started as a small giggle, then grew into the kind of laughter that bordered on hysteria, the release of tension that had been building for months. "What?" Antonio demanded, though his own mouth was twitching toward a smile. "Look at us," Margaret gasped between bursts of laughter. "I came to Italy to find love, and instead I'm destroying your family's kitchen, while you turn perfectly good fish into something that might be suitable for shoe leather." Antonio looked around the chaos, then at his wife, flour in her hair, sauce on her cheek, eyes bright with mirth despite the culinary catastrophe surrounding them, and felt something settle in his chest. This wasn't the elegant, sophisticated life he had imagined when he dreamed of their future together. It was better. It was real. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, pulling Margaret into his arms, despite the flour that would inevitably transfer to his clothes. "Do you know what I love about you?" he murmured against her hair. "My exceptional cooking skills, your courage to be imperfect in a new place, your willingness to fail spectacularly rather than not try at all." He pulled back to look at her face. "Most people would have given up and gone back to Boston by now." "Most people," Margaret said, rising on her toes to kiss him softly, "didn't fall in love with an Italian professor who quotes Dante while attempting to scale fish. They worked through the night, enlisted help from neighbors who seemed to materialize whenever disaster threatened, and somehow managed to create a Christmas Eve dinner that, while unconventional, was filled with more love and laughter than any meal Margaret could remember. Elena, recovered enough to join them at the table, pronounced the evening perfect despite the burnt edges on the vegetables and the slightly chewy texture of the homemade pasta. "This is what Christmas should be," she declared, raising her glass of wine in a toast. "Not perfect, but filled with people who choose to keep trying." As 1946 dawned, Margaret began to feel the first stirrings of something she had never expected to find in Italy, the sense that she was not just visiting someone else's life, but actively building her own. Her Italian had improved to the point where she could hold her own in conversations with Antonio's colleagues at the university. Her work at the local hospital had evolved into a position that allowed her to implement some of the medical practices she had learned during her nursing training in America, while also learning techniques that had been developed by Italian doctors who had worked with limited resources during the war. But it was the small moments that truly signaled her transformation from visitor to resident. The morning when she automatically switched to Italian while comforting a crying child in the market square. The afternoon when she found herself defending Italian coffee to a group of American tourists who were complaining about the small cup sizes. The evening when Antonio came home from the university to find her deep in conversation with Signora Rossi about the proper way to preserve tomatoes for winter, conducting the entire discussion in Italian, peppered with gestures that would have made her Boston relatives laugh. "You are becoming one of us," Antonio observed that night as they prepared for bed. "Or maybe," Margaret said thoughtfully, "I'm discovering who I was always meant to be." The changes weren't entirely one-sided. Antonio, inspired by Margaret's stories of her nursing experiences and her insights into American medical practices, began incorporating new perspectives into his literature classes. He started teaching a course on war poetry that examined how different cultures processed trauma and loss, drawing from both Italian and American sources. "My students are fascinated by the American poems you showed me," he told Margaret one evening as they walked through the Villa Borghese gardens. They had never considered that suffering could be expressed so differently, yet with the same fundamental human truth. "Maybe that's what we're doing," Margaret mused, watching couples stroll along the pathways in the golden light of early evening. Learning that love can be expressed differently while containing the same fundamental truth. Their second spring in Rome brought unexpected challenges. Margaret received a letter from her parents in Boston, written in her mother's careful script, informing her that Dr. Richards, the man she was supposed to have married in another lifetime, had become engaged to Margaret's former best friend, Catherine Morrison. "They seem very happy together," her mother had written, though Margaret could sense the underlying questions in every carefully chosen word. Catherine mentioned that she hopes you are equally content with your choices. Margaret stared at the letter for a long time, trying to summon some feeling about this news. She attempted to picture Dr. Richards, but could only manage a vague impression of proper manners and conservative political opinions. Catherine's face was clearer in her memory, but felt like someone she had known in childhood rather than a friend she had seen less than 3 years ago. "Regrets?" Antonio asked gently when she told him about the letter. Margaret considered the question seriously. "I keep trying to imagine what my life would look like if I had made different choices. Dr. Richards and I would have a nice house in Brookline by now. Catherine and I would plan dinner parties and compare notes on our children's schools. I would volunteer at the church auxiliary and host bridge games on Wednesday afternoons. That sounds pleasant." "It does, doesn't it? Safe and predictable and pleasant." Margaret folded the letter and set it aside. "I think that's what troubles me most. I can imagine that life so clearly, and I can see how I might have been content with it, but I can't imagine being passionate about it." She looked around their small apartment with its mismatched furniture and walls lined with books in 3 languages. Through the window she could hear the sound of Elena practicing piano in the apartment below, stumbling over a difficult passage in a Chopin nocturne before starting again with determined optimism. "This life we're building," Margaret continued, "it's not always pleasant. Sometimes it's difficult and uncertain and requires more courage than I thought I possessed. But I wake up every morning excited to see what will happen next. I can't imagine trading that for pleasant predictability." That summer they received news that would test their relationship in ways neither had anticipated. Elena's fiancé, Dr. Marco Salvatori, had been offered a position at a hospital in Milan. Elena was torn between loyalty to her brother and her future with Marco. "I cannot leave Antonio," she confided to Margaret during one of their evening walks along the Tiber. "He has lost so much already. Our parents, our older brother Giuliano, who died in North Africa, the life he had built before the war. I am all the family he has left." Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced when watching Antonio's truck disappear from the field hospital. The rational part of her mind understood that Elena needed to build her own life, just as Margaret had done. But Elena had become more than a sister-in-law. She had become Margaret's guide to Italian life, her closest friend, her anchor in a world that still sometimes felt foreign. "What does your heart tell you to do?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "My heart tells me that I love Marco enough to follow him anywhere, but my conscience tells me that family comes first, always." That evening, Margaret found Antonio in his study, grading papers with less than his usual attention to detail. She settled into the chair across from his desk, the same chair where Elena usually sat when she needed her brother's advice. "Elena told you about Milan," she said. Antonio set down his pen and rubbed his eyes. "She tells me she won't go, but I see how she looks at Marco, how her face changes when he walks into a room. She loves him the way—" He paused, meeting Margaret's eyes. "The way you and I love each other, with her whole heart, without reservation. Then you need to convince her to go." "How can I do that? She's right. I have lost so much. The thought of losing her too—" Antonio's voice carried a weight of grief that reminded Margaret of their early conversations in the field hospital. Margaret reached across the desk to take his hand. "You won't be losing her. You'll be setting her free to build the life she wants, the same way she helped me find the courage to build a life here with you." The conversation that followed stretched deep into the night, covering territory they had never explored before. Antonio spoke about the guilt he carried from surviving the war when so many others hadn't, about his fear that happiness was temporary and would inevitably be taken away. Margaret shared her own fears about being the foreign wife who had disrupted the close bond between brother and sister. "Maybe that's what love really means," Margaret said, as dawn light began to filter through their bedroom window. "Not holding on to people so tightly that they can't grow, but caring about them enough to want their happiness, even when it changes your own life." The farewell dinner Elena and Margaret organized for Elena and Marco became a celebration that encompassed their entire neighborhood. Signora Rossi contributed her famous ragu, the baker from down the street provided fresh bread, and even the normally reserved professor from Antonio's university appeared with a bottle of wine that he claimed had been aging in his cellar since before the war. Elena, radiant in a blue dress that matched her eyes, moved between guests with the grace of someone who had learned to find joy in transitions rather than security in stasis. Margaret watched her sister-in-law and felt a bittersweet pride that reminded her of watching a favorite student graduate. "She will be happy in Milan," Marco told Margaret as they stood on the small terrace watching the sun set over Rome's ancient skyline. "And she will miss you terribly. You have become the sister she never had." "And she taught me that family isn't just about blood," Margaret replied. "It's about choosing to care for each other through all the changes life brings." Eleanor's departure left a void in their daily routine that took months to fill. Margaret found herself cooking for 2 instead of 3, buying flowers for only 1 vase instead of the elaborate arrangements Elena had loved. Antonio threw himself into his work with an intensity that worried Margaret, until she realized it was his way of processing the loneliness. But the space Elena left behind also created room for Margaret and Antonio to discover new dimensions of their relationship. Without Elena as intermediary and translator, they were forced to navigate Italian social situations together, developing their own blend of American directness and Italian warmth. Margaret began to understand the subtle rhythms of Roman life, not through Elena's explanations, but through her own observations and mistakes. They established new traditions that reflected their unique partnership. Sunday mornings were reserved for reading, Margaret with her Italian language books and Antonio with his poetry collections, but both curled together on the small sofa in their living room. Thursday evenings became their time to explore different neighborhoods of Rome, trying restaurants they had never visited, and walking through areas of the city that tourists never saw. Most importantly, they learned to be homesick together. Margaret missed the changing seasons of New England, the particular quality of light that fell across Boston Common in autumn. Antonio missed the scholarly debates with colleagues who had been scattered by war, the specific comfort of sitting in his childhood bedroom when the world felt overwhelming. "I think," Margaret said one evening as they walked through the Jewish quarter, "that homesickness isn't really about places. It's about the people we were in those places, and wondering if we could ever be that uncomplicated again." "And do you want to be that uncomplicated again?" Margaret considered the question as they passed ancient ruins illuminated by modern streetlights, a visual reminder of how present and past could coexist in the same space. "No," she said finally. "I like who we've become together, even if it's more complicated than anything I could have imagined." Their 3rd year in Rome brought a letter from Elena that changed everything. She was pregnant, she wrote, and wanted Margaret to be with her for the birth. "You are the closest thing to a mother I have," Elena's carefully scripted words read. "I need you with me when this baby comes into the world." The request required Margaret to travel to Milan for several weeks, leaving Antonio alone for the longest period since their marriage. The separation gave both of them perspective on how completely their lives had become intertwined. Margaret arrived in Milan to find Elena glowing with pregnancy, but homesick for Rome in ways that Marco's love couldn't entirely heal. "I miss the sound of our street," Elena confessed as they walked through Milan's efficient modern neighborhoods. "I miss Signora Rossi's gossip and the way the baker always gave us an extra roll when Antonio wasn't looking. And I miss the way you could make any situation feel like an adventure," Margaret replied. "Even learning to cook became fun when you were there to laugh at my mistakes." Elena's labor began on a rainy Tuesday morning, and Margaret found herself drawing on skills she hadn't used since her nursing days. She coached Elena through contractions, translated between Elena and the midwife, when medical Italian proved more complex than conversational vocabulary, and held her sister-in-law's hand when the pain became overwhelming. When little Giuliano, named for the uncle he would never meet, finally arrived, Margaret was the first person besides the midwife to hold him. Looking down at his tiny face, so clearly a combination of Elena's delicate features and Marco's strong jawline, Margaret felt a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. "He's perfect," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "And he will know his Zia, Margaret," Elena said softly. "Even if we live in different cities, he will know that he has an aunt who crossed an ocean for love and taught his mother that courage comes in many forms." Margaret returned to Rome with stories, photographs, and a renewed appreciation for the life she and Antonio had built together. Antonio met her at the train station with flowers and an expression of relief that suggested the separation had been as difficult for him as it had been for her. "How was Milan?" he asked as they walked through the familiar streets toward home. "Modern, efficient, nothing like Rome." Margaret squeezed his arm. "I spent the entire time missing the chaos of our neighborhood, the way our baker argues with his wife every morning, even the way our plumbing makes those terrible noises." "And Elena?" "Happy, tired, already planning when we can visit again." Margaret paused as they reached their building, looking up at the windows that had become home. "Antonio, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." He turned to face her, concern flickering in his amber eyes. "What is it? Do you ever regret it? Giving up the possibility of a simpler life with someone who already understood your world?" Antonio was quiet for so long that Margaret began to fear his answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful consideration. "I think," he said slowly, "that love is not about finding someone who makes life simpler. It's about finding someone who makes complexity worthwhile. Before I met you, my life was certainly less complicated, but it was also smaller, contained within boundaries I didn't even realize I had built." He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize she had been shedding. "You have taught me that the most beautiful things in life require us to stretch beyond what we thought we were capable of. Our love story isn't simple, cara mia, but it is ours, and I would choose it again every day in any lifetime." Standing on their doorstep in the soft Roman twilight, surrounded by the sounds of their neighborhood settling into evening routines, Margaret felt the last of her doubts dissolve. This was where she belonged, not because it was easy, but because it was real. Because it had required the best of both of them to create something entirely new. As they climbed the narrow stairs to their apartment, Margaret thought about the letter she would write to her parents that evening. She would tell them about baby Giuliano, about Elena's happiness in Milan, about the way Rome looked in spring when the wisteria bloomed over ancient walls. But mostly, she would tell them about the truth she had discovered, that the most extraordinary lives were built not on grand gestures, but on the daily choice to keep growing, keep learning, keep loving, even when it meant becoming someone you never imagined you could be. Years later, when Margaret would tell their story to the children who called her Nonna, she would always emphasize this, that love was not a feeling you fell into, but a choice you made every day. That the best adventures began when you were brave enough to say yes to something that seemed impossible, and that sometimes the most extraordinary lives grew from the simplest decision to trust that tomorrow might be worth the courage it took to reach for it. They had met in war, and they had never let go, not because it was easy, but because they had learned that the most beautiful things in life were worth holding on to, even when the holding required everything they had to give.